Welcome to the Lens of History. You are with Luke Herbert, speaking with special guests and placing the microscope on current and historical events.
Welcome, listeners, to this inaugural edition of The Lens of History. I am your host and facilitator, Luke Herbert, and joining me in the studio today, as at least in the Southern Hemisphere we go into spring, is the noted political commentator, Martin Bain. How are you today, Martin?
Very well, thank you, Luke, and great to be on the show. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us in the studio, and also joining me is the noted author, Justin Oldham. How are you doing today, Justin?
Doing very well, coming to you all the way from Anchorage, Alaska, and very glad to be here before the snow flies.
Well, today we're going to talk about events in the Ukraine and by logical extension, Eastern Europe. And I think I'm just going to start off with Martin because he's in the UK and he has more of a localised view than I do from New Zealand and Justin has from Alaska. So how would you view the goings on in the Ukraine, Martin? Do you view it as another sort of Czechoslovakia whereby the Nazis gobbled up that country, basically gaining some free real estate unopposed by the Western powers? Or do you see it as an internal power play by Putin to gain popularity at home?
I guess I see it. I think there are elements of certainly the two things you've mentioned, but I think it, the show is called The Lens of History, so I think you have to start with that whole concept in that the Ukraine was part of the USSR. So I think listeners have to understand that it's not two distinct separate countries that have never been part of the same political union in the past. So I think you have to look at it from that historical perspective that, since the creation of the USSR up until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Eastern Bloc and the Communist Pact, Ukraine was an intrinsic part of the Soviet Union. So, I think people have to understand that and see that, Luke. And this whole thing of I don't see it necessarily as a out and out land grab in the sense of what the Nazi regime and Hitler was doing with Czechoslovakia. Yeah, I think I see this a little bit more of Putin, yes, playing some internal politics and playing to his home audience, but I see this much more in the limited context of keeping his own house in order. I don't see any reason for it to extend beyond that one, and I sort of think NATO are just playing continuing to play the American puppet game of being the world police. And you have to look around and see what NATO have done, the disasters that are, evident in the top parts of Africa with the Arab Spring. And I just sort of question why the US and NATO feel it's appropriate for them to go into parts of the world where they really don't understand anything about culture and the politics there and say, by the way, we want to change you to being a totally democratic country. By the way, the only reason to my mind these things have been done is purely for greed and money, and that the Americans think with the right regime in place, they can sell arms and then, their puppet commercial organizations can then get the big contracts to either exploit natural resources or sell natural resources. So I don't see it in the context of anything more than maybe Putin deciding he needs to play to an audience, but then also doing some housekeeping in his own backyard and securing his own backyard. I don't see it being anything more than that.
And just before I go to Justin then, at what point would you say then would have to be reached before, you went from the situation where Putin is doing some house cleaning to the Russians going into an expansionist mode westward? So do you think there would be a so-called red line or a point where that would happen, where you could say this is actually occurring?
I just can't see any logic in why Putin would want to continue to move westward, and start anything with NATO. I mean, we have to understand Putin's past. He was with the KGB, so he was involved in keeping the Soviet Union secure from the Western democracies. So he understands exactly what NATO can and can't do, and what NATO will and won't do. And I think the more and more I look at what's going on in Ukraine, NATO is being made to look stupid. Putin is clearly knowing how far he can push. NATO won't do anything. There will be no boots on the ground. There will be no bombing of any targets in Ukraine. This is all bluster by NATO because, unfortunately, it's had its nose broken fairly significantly over Syria, where the Americans and NATO to achieve nothing. The Arab Springs, anybody who doesn't think those were unmitigated disasters that have actually put those countries backward, probably doesn't actually understand what was going on the ground, and probably just relies on the mainstream media to actually tell them that. So I don't think there are any red lines. I think a lot of this is absolute scaremongering to make people afraid and think that Putin wants to start a world war. I think we have to be more clever here. The threat of a major world war does not come from the Soviet Union. If it's going to come from anywhere, it's probably going to come from China, not from what Putin wants to do. I just think it's absolute scaremongering by, I'm going to be fairly brutal, a lot of people who I think rely on the mainstream media to tell them stuff and don't really have the brain power to actually look behind it and actually make logical conclusions.
Alright, and just before I move on, I have to say that when Putin makes the kind of statements that Hitler did about uniting, in this case it's Russian instead of German-speaking peoples, and he uses the same kind of, even, I wouldn't necessarily say mannerisms, but the same sort of ideological wordings, I get a chill that runs down my spine, and...
Well, I don't, Luke. I don't get that. I mean, clearly he's playing to an audience, and I think people have got to understand that there is a difference between the words that political leaders speak and the intrinsic actions that political leaders do. You only have to look across all parts of the world. We can go, even maybe to New Zealand a little bit and say, hang on a minute, you've got an indigenous people and you've got an English speaking people, and there are probably people in New Zealand who are probably from the indigenous Aboriginal races who probably would love to just probably chuck anybody who isn't of that out of New Zealand, and who probably will go on social media to actually say that, and there will be people who do that, but no one gets up in arms with it. Putin is playing to an audience. I just think you have to understand that that's all it is. He's playing to an audience, and he's probably flexing some political and some military muscle just so that Ukraine understands that where its political loyalties should lie more maybe than with the West. And I think it's fair to say that if you look at where Ukraine is in the world map, and I suggest that everybody actually gets an atlas and actually looks at where Ukraine is in the world, Ukraine is much more, east-centric, east-focused, and where it is in the world, its big political, military, and commercial neighbor is going to be the Soviet Union. So therefore, you would understand why why Russia would actually want to make sure that they understand and comprehend that its natural relationship is clearly not with the NATO and Western Europe. Its natural relationship is going to always be probably looking to its northern and easterly neighbor.
Alright, and then just switching back to you, Justin, because to me this whole situation stinks of another Munich, another 1938, in which, okay, today it's NATO rather than just the British and the French, but to me it just stinks of, we're going to give them the real estate and we can avoid a fight, and the miscalculation there is, of course, that if you don't contain, in this case, the Russians, they simply keep expanding westwards, and eventually you have to fight the Russians, in Poland and even Eastern Germany. So how does this look to you?
I do think there are elements of appeasement in play here. Now, when we look at the situation from the European point of view, there is a very definite demarcation in play. From the European point of view, Ukraine has very definitely, historically, always been in the Russian ballpark. So it's very easy for somebody from the United Kingdom, for example, to say, yeah, sure, let them have it. It's no big deal. But the problem is, when we see a resurgent Russia that is in the process of rebuilding the former Soviet Union, we have to ask ourselves, why are they rebuilding the former Soviet Union? And to take a closer look at that, the Russian economy is presently built on quicksand. The country is being heavily influenced by a variety of extremist factions right now, and the short version of this is that the current regime that is in charge of Russia has two choices. Eventually, they go down in flames, or they have to resort to the tool of war to stay in power. So as they continue to reforge the old Soviet Union in the hopes that they stay in power, ultimately they're going to choose the tools of war to stay in power, because they will never have the economic prosperity necessary to drown out the flames of extremism that are spreading from one end of their country to the other. So with that in mind, giving them Ukraine, giving into this appeasement, fundamentally works the same way as letting Nazi Germany have Czechoslovakia in 1938, because all we're doing is aiding and abetting an aggressive power here. All we're doing is buying time so that instead of war in 2015, it might be 2020, it might be 2025 if we're truly fortunate, but ultimately all we're doing is throwing red meat to a Russian bear that will eventually decide that it's more expedient to fight than it is to negotiate. And I'm not saying this entirely from the position of somebody who wants to be critical of the Europeans. I'm saying this from the position of somebody who's being critical of multiple American administrations. In the wake of the Cold War, since the Berlin Wall has come down, American presidents have retreated U.S. foreign policy from the world stage. And since he came into office January 20th of 2009 is officially when he was sworn into office, President Obama has made it very clear to America's enemies around the world that we're going to make you love us by showing you how far off the international stage we can get. Now, this is my opinion, but in the course of pursuing his lighter footprint, in the course of withdrawing American power from the world stage, all he's done is encourage radical elements around the world to get so bold that in the course of the last 6 calendar years, the Russians have themselves become so bold that now they can intimidate NATO, so much so that we are at the present moment in time. Here we are, early September of 2014, and I want to be sure to say this for the sake of the historical record, because when this podcast is uploaded to the internet, it will essentially outlive all of us. And 100 years from now, when people are listening to this recording trying to figure out what we were thinking, I think it'll be important for them to have that piece of context. So my question, for the sake of debate, which I would like to ask Martin, given the fact that the United Kingdom and other countries now has to start taking very serious defensive measures against rising extremism that my own country is not reacting to seriously right now, what do you guys do if you're wrong about the Russian calculation, because 5 years from now, suppose, if Putin is able to bully Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia into voting themselves into the Pan-Asian Federation, if he gets them with ballots instead of bullets, then what do you do if on the night before Christmas or some such thing, if he decides to shut off the flow of oil and gas to Western Europe? Then you know beyond any shadow of a doubt that you bet wrong. Then what do you do? Because we over here in the United States, because our leaders have so thoroughly stepped off the stage, we may not be able to help you.
Well, I think first of all, you have to understand there's a contractual and legal obligation within any member of NATO to help. So if you take the whole concept of what NATO means and what NATO is, an attack on one member of NATO is an attack on every part of NATO. So if we take that gameplay to its logical conclusion and Russia decides to attack a NATO member, every part of NATO is legally obliged to help on that one. So get that out the way, legal niceties. I would even take it a step back and say, well, what gives NATO and I'll be quite brutal here and say NATO is just an extension of US foreign policy. NATO doesn't make any decisions without the US actually telling them that they can actually make those decisions. So to my mind, whatever NATO does, it's US foreign policy. And I actually think it may be I think you were slightly disingenuous, I think, Justin, to say that US leaders have stepped away from foreign policy. They may have directly, and to the American audience, to the vast majority of Americans who get their news from mainstream media and therefore believe it, they haven't stepped off the pedal. They basically tell NATO what to do. Let's just go back a minute. Nobody, I believe, in Europe was interested in actually intervening in any of the Arab Springs. It was purely because the US said it was a good idea that eventually everybody else in Europe started to do it and NATO started to do it. I just wonder what gives the Americans and NATO the right to start dictating what's going to happen in other parts of the world. You know, we seem to come from a very arrogant, high-handed approach that, oh yes, we're democratic. Sorry, I don't believe our countries are democratic in any way, shape, or form. It's just a different form of power elitism that we think because we go and cast a ballot every 4 years, we actually have some control over. So I go back to the point, what gives NATO and the United States the right to tell Russia what it should and shouldn't do? Maybe if countries actually were interested in themselves rather than trying to project power into places they shouldn't really be projecting power, half these problems would go away. If no one actually was that concerned and up in arms over what was happening in other parts of the world, half these things wouldn't happen. Half extremism happens because people take notice of it. You get a bombing, like these beheadings of journalists. If no one actually paid any attention, none of this would happen. So I think we create the problem because we pay attention to it. As for betting wrong, I'm not, we have to understand there are natural spheres in the world. You think of the US, you could turn around and say Canada, Mexico, and some of those is a natural sphere of political, military, and economic influence that works. There are parts of Europe that are naturally going to coalesce and want to work together military, economically, and politically, and there are going to be parts of what we call Eastern Europe that will actually want to do that. So I think people have to be clever and understand natural influences and natural boundaries in the world of where influences lie, and not get too hung up over that one. As for Putin turning the oil and gas off, never ever going to happen. Absolutely not going to happen. They make too much money out of it. They are going to they will use it as a threatening tool, certainly with Western Europe. Okay, with some of their Eastern Bloc allies on their borders, it's a slightly different thing, because I think what they're trying to do is make them understand where the influence in their local territory lies. But coming out into Western Europe, he's not going to switch the electricity off. He's not going to switch the gas off, because ultimately he's just going to lose too much money.
And just before we move on, Martin, I've got a couple of questions for you. The first one is, you talk about the NATO treaty and that if one member of NATO gets attacked, everyone's basically obliged to come to its aid. How does that really hold up any better than France and Britain's guarantee to Czechoslovakia in the 30s, because basically, it's a similar guarantee? And my second question is, and just touch on this briefly then, because the other day I was having some interesting discussions with a friend, and haven't you basically then made the argument for that the Europeans should take a greater responsibility for their own security in terms of military spending if they don't want US influence over NATO?
Okay, going back to Czechoslovakia, you are absolutely right there in that any agreement, any contractual legal agreement is only worth what the people who sign it will actually put into it. I don't think you can draw the natural parallel between what France and the United Kingdom did to guarantee Czechoslovakia in the similar light to NATO. I think you can't make the analogy and say they are similar. They were agreements of their time, and I still think if you go back to that time when Britain and France guaranteed Czechoslovakia's borders of security, that was potentially organisations making promises that there was no way they could ever cash if they were actually called to do that one. So I don't think that's a fair and necessarily a logical and sensible analogy to make. NATO, you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, it's never actually been tested, so no one knows if, for example, a member of NATO gets attacked by somebody, whether the rest of NATO will actually intervene. That's a very valid and good point to make there, Luke. We just do not know anything about that one. As for should NATO be, as for your question, should the Europeans be taking more control? Absolutely, they should be. We should be saying to the US, guess what? Stay in your sphere, do what you want to do in your natural sphere, but don't try and influence, dictate, and say what happens in Europe. I have to go back and, hopefully Justin won't take this as a slight on himself, but, so many Americans don't even understand where Europe is on the map, and that Europe is actually made up of so many different countries and entities. I think there's a huge education process that needs to happen here, but I would absolutely endorse that one, that maybe Europe does need to turn around and say, thank you very much to the US. Do we actually need your influence anymore? I'm probably going to suggest that there could be a natural point in time, maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, when maybe NATO naturally splits up and there is a European security and political. There's currently a security, political organization. There's a economic organization. There's a monetary organization. The logical extension to take that through to its own military is not a million miles away from that one. And the US maybe would welcome to withdraw from that one, because it's spending billions of dollars supporting Europe. I got to turn around and say I'd rather the US continue to look after itself and let us look after ourselves.
And I want to come back to that topic on another program, because I've had discussions with someone along those lines, but from an Australian and New Zealand standpoint. And I ultimately do think if we're going to avert the next world war, that somebody has to stand up and increase military spending and take on the sort of role or lighten the US's load a little bit, just for the sake of global security. But that doesn't look like happening. But just moving forward with the program, overnight, my time, at least here in New Zealand, there was a ceasefire announced in the Ukraine, and this, had been in the works for a few days, and I can't say I was surprised in the least that Putin would call for a ceasefire after Russian forces controlled all the key strategic locations in the western Ukraine, particularly the ports and the border areas. So basically, the two ways that the Russians can go from here is they can simply mount a political offensive and destabilize the Western Ukraine sufficiently that they can send in their troops to occupy the rest of the country under the justification of the peacekeepers are providing security, or they can just flat out continue what they've been doing by making limited incursions and arming and training separatists. So I'm going to start off with Justin. Which way do things go from here?
Ultimately, I think they play out just as you described. This is a circumstance in which it's either or. The only question is, which way does it go? I think that in large part, contemporary leaders are not used to the old Cold War playbook anymore. I mean, that what you've just described was something done by proxy in a great many theaters around the world throughout the Cold War, especially in the 1970s and in the 1980s. Ultimately, Putin's short-term goal is Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And as Martin says, he's most likely intending to stick to his sphere of influence. That's quite likely in the short term. But in the long term, I say that because his government and his economy rests on a foundation of quicksand, he's got no choice in the long run other than to seek another fight, which for him is historically the conquest of Western Europe.
Martin, just to counterbalance Justin and my own views, what do you see is happening next in the Ukraine and within the border states?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite a difficult challenge that we face. That the perception of this being a political thing, and that some people in Ukraine are in favor of having a closer ties with Russia and have voted for that one. It was very interesting when there were elections or votes taken, just how vociferous the United States were, that how fake some of these referendums and elections were. I think that's the pot. It's a kettle calling the pot black when we look at just how undemocratic the United States is. And I just chuck this out for the listeners. Guess what? No American voter actually votes for the President of the United States. So, I will not be lectured by America on anything to do with democracy, because it doesn't even understand the word itself, in that it's not one man, one vote. So, I think you have to understand that whole viewpoint of, if it's done by people voting, what gives the right of somebody to disagree with that? As for what's going to happen, well, the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, was part of essence of Russia. So, if people in the Ukraine feel that they would rather be more associated with Russia than they would be with Brussels, Amsterdam, Paris, London, and Berlin, they have every right to actually do that. To me, the argument that seems to be put across is, no, that's not in line with what NATO and American foreign policy is, therefore it must be wrong. I don't buy that. I think classic example, I can talk about this one in the fact of, what was going on in Northern Ireland since the beginning of the last century, that there was terrorism that was funded by too many Americans who decided to stick their money and their paws into something in Northern Ireland that they knew so little about. So I don't see any change. I just see this as, again, an extension of American foreign policy. They don't like something. They don't like somebody having the gall and the balls to actually stand up and want to expand. So therefore, they will try and slap them down. If Russia wants to do this in its sphere of influence, guess what? Russia should be able to get away with that. I don't see anybody prepared to go to war with China over Tibet. You could make the same case, and I don't know why, we're having a discussion about the Ukraine, but we're not having a discussion about why the Americans won't stand and NATO won't go nose to nose with China and say, you have 48 hours to leave Tibet. Oh, guess what? It's not really in NATO and America's best interest and there's nothing in Tibet that they actually want. So therefore, they really don't care. It's a shocking double standard, which just goes to show that most elected political leaders should be taken out, put against the wall, and dealt with. It's just shocking double standards here that. In some parts of the world, America and NATO are prepared to get involved. In other parts of the world, they don't care because there's nothing in it for them.
Well, I think I'm going to come back to China and the areas of the world NATO doesn't get involved in on a future program, because there's important implications at the Horn of Africa where the Western powers have stayed away from since the early 90s, and the strategic importance of that area that we will come back to on the program. But before I tackle the topic of Russian military modernization, I would like to just ask you both a question, and the question is, where do you think the Russian sphere of influence from their standpoint ends? And if I had to hesitate an educated sort of, not guess, but looking at the recent history, I would say the Russian sphere of influence from their standpoint is, let's just say, that pre-1989 borders, which I don't think NATO would find too acceptable. So starting with you, Justin, where do you think the Russian sphere of influence ends from their standpoint?
I do think they want to reestablish the 1989 borders, but because of the nature of the extremism that's affecting their country, I think that after they have reacquired Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and the aforementioned Ukraine, I think they're going to turn their attention south and east. They're going to go back to the stands.
Martin, what's your take? I would actually have to agree with that assessment of Justin. I think you can't look at, I don't think they're going to be I don't think they're going to go after things like Poland, Czechoslovakia, what was ex-Yugoslavia. No, because I think that within every sort of influential sphere, there are countries on the borders that are naturally on the border. So I think there are going to be some countries that will, either swing one way or the other. But I think he's absolutely right. Maybe going back to getting some of their Baltic assets back, and I certainly think absolutely going back south and east is certainly going to happen, and Ukraine clearly fits into that one. And I also think I think to start wrapping up, I think we have to understand that the Cold War, in the sense that we see the Berlin Wall stopped, but I don't think the political machinations of US and Russian intelligence and spheres of influence has actually stopped. And I think a lot of what's going on with some of these radical elements in Russia, I would think if we actually did something very obvious and very clever, was follow the money, we would discover that those organizations are being funded and encouraged either by the United States or by their allies. So I don't think you can say that this extremism in Ukraine and other parts of Russia is natural extremism. It is being funded and influenced as part of some kind of global political agenda that the US wants to have, because it needs to continue to destabilize the Soviet Union, because at some stage the United States is probably going to get its nose very clearly smacked by China. Once China actually gets up to speed in probably the next 15 to 20 years, the United States is probably going to become a fairly insignificant power in the Pacific. The only area it's probably going to be able to do any influence is actually to start to look west to across the Atlantic, because at some stage China's just going to smack its nose in the Pacific. And I think a lot of very intelligent, coherent and logical Americans understand that their influence in the Pacific is waning very, very quickly. So let's look somewhere where they can actually have some influence.
I'm going to disagree with that, but I want to phrase my disagreement in the form of a question. Given the way extremist money is centering on the Middle East, and given the way a lot of that money is focusing itself on channeling specifically through Turkey into Russia, I can't help but thinking that at some future point that the Russians could lose control of that situation, because as we're seeing, the situation in the Middle East with ISIL, et cetera, as that continues to metastasize, you're going to see multiple streams of extremist money going into the going into the Russian heartland. And as good as the Russian intelligence services are, nobody's intelligence services are good enough to stop that kind of onslaught in the long run. So ultimately, I still say that faced with that kind of long-term threat, they're going to choose war as the tool to solve that problem.
All right, Dan, and we're just about at a wrap, and I was going to touch upon the issue of Russia's military modernization and how it is going to influence the course of future events, but the clock has run out on its inaugural program, and I do want to come back to Russia's military modernization on a future program, so thank you for joining us in the studio, Martin and Justin.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
You have been listening to The Lens of History with Luke Herbert.